For here's somebody who's reasoning, explaining, and what? Proving that Christ had to suffer, setting it forth, making the case. Okay, we won't belabor it, but the word translated reasoned, really has at its heart this idea of dialogue. These arguments are not prepared, pre-delivered, in other words, they're just not packaged arguments. No, they're something that come out of the context of interaction, conversation, questions, and debate. It's just a vital reminder to us that apologetics has to do with people. And we find this same kind of term used with respect to Paul's approach in other contexts. In Athens, both in the synagogue and in the marketplace. This is chapter 17 and verse 17 further on. In Corinth, in the synagogue with the Jews and the Greeks in chapter 18 and verse 4. Keep going forward in the book of Acts. And in Ephesus for the first 3 months in the synagogue, and then daily over the course of 2 years in a rented lecture hall in chapter 19, verses 8 through 10. So biblical apologetics seeks to persuade people of the truth of Christianity so that they can believe in Jesus. We want, again, the intellectual permission, the intellectual invitation, ultimately the goal, the trajectory of it all, believe in Jesus. And biblical apologetics is not a theoretical exercise, but it engages in dialogue with real people and with real questions. Don't answer questions they're not asking. Sometimes you have to question the questioner to find out, what's the real question that they want to ask? And sometimes awkwardly, they ask questions that they really don't want answers to. What they really want is to get at the root of the matter. Something is deeply disturbing them. And to kind of just in a very friendly way say, let's just have a frank conversation about this. There's some deep life issues, some ultimate issues, sometimes some deeply painful issues. And folks just want a dialogue and a conversation. Okay, so let's move on, tackle maybe just one more here, and then just take a bit of a break, because this next one is another section in Acts chapter 17, which can be a bit of a change of gears, because we switch from a Jewish context to a Gentile context. And that makes a difference, doesn't it, in your apologetic? Because it's like doing cross-cultural evangelism when you shift from one culture to another. It kind of changes everything. Acts chapter 17 then, beginning at verse 22. Let me get there. Acts 7:22, and then reading down through verse 34. And this is Paul's address at the Areopagus there in Athens. And it says, beginning at verse 2, "So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, 'Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription: to the unknown God. And what therefore you worship is unknown. This I proclaim to you.'" This is masterful, right? Masterful. "The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward Him and find Him. Yet he's actually not far from each one of us. For, and this is as one of their philosopher poets, he's quoting, in him we live and move and have our being, even as some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art of imagination of man, the times of ignorance God overlooked. But now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Note, there's the resurrection from the dead. And now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, well, we'll hear you again about this. And so Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed, and among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So we note from verse 31, he has given proof of this by raising him from the dead. Proof. Well, it's an interesting term that's used here, because the term pistis, which is, it's just the term faith or belief. He's given faith of this by raising him from the dead. So it's interesting that the idea of this is proof, because it's referring to a ground, this idea of a ground or a basis upon which you would establish your reliance for something. So it's not so much faith, but as a basis for faith, or a basis for confidence. So we'd say that's the proof. I believe because I have a basis for my belief. I'm confident because I have a basis for my confidence. So in this case, it's the resurrection. Now that's the ground for our conviction or our trust or our reliance or our faith, is what he's saying. So in this section of Acts, we find Paul in a predominantly Gentile context. And his approach to proclaiming the gospel is quite different from his approach among the Jews described earlier in the chapter. And we just looked at that in chapter 17, 1 through 4. But with the Jews and Gentile God-fearers, he started with the Jewish writings, right? The Hebrew scriptures, which were familiar to them, and of which he was expert, right? And they knew that, and which they already accepted as true. So it made a lot of sense to start there. But in Athens now, the Areopagus, in Athens, however, he was among Gentiles who were immersed in Greek thinking. And his starting points in communicating his message were twofold, really, here. One was Greek religion. This pantheon, the Greek mythology, the Greek gods. Greek religion and Greek philosophy. Not in great depth, but, making passing remarks as though, do you want to discuss this in more detail? We could discuss this in more detail. But at least giving a sense that he acknowledges such things. At least using Greek religion and Greek philosophy as some reference point of identification, let's say. As in the case of some point of Greek mythology, so is this point I'm making about the Christian faith. He used a statue dedicated to the unknown God as a starting point to explain that they did not actually know the one true God who had created them. He had identified a fault line in their religious thinking, an uncertainty about the true nature and number of the gods. He wasn't saying, well, sure, there are all these other gods, but you forgot one. But he's saying that in your consideration of reality and worldview, you acknowledged that there was a gap, some unknown, or some possibility that you could have overlooked God or a God in some way or respect. And I'm here to tell you, Paul says, you have indeed, and that God is the God of the Bible, and that God is the one true God. And then he makes reference to Greek philosophy. He's certainly sufficiently well versed in the writings of Greek philosopher poets. We used to quote one in verse 28. He's able to use the truth within their own belief system, however limited it was, as a platform which to proclaim the whole message of God, of which that truth was part. So using these starting points, he then dangled before them this hook that the one true God has appointed a man to be judge, and that the proof of this was that this man had risen from the dead. And that's verse 31. And whether Paul was cut short at this point by the opposition of some of his audience, verse 32, that they kind of mocked him, or whether he deliberately ended his speech at this point as some kind of a cliffhanger intended to provoke further discussion, we can't be sure. But it's important to notice, however, that he presents the resurrection of Jesus as a key apologetic evidence for the truth of Christianity. Other New Testament passages show this same tendency. You go back to Peter's preaching on the day of Pentecost, Acts 2:32. You look at Paul's prologue to the book of Romans chapter 1 and verse 4, and then Paul's credo kind of statement on the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 4. So this record of Paul's activity in Athens sometimes, criticized as a failure. Oh, they laughed him out of town kind of thing. But it's suggested that it was an attempt by Paul to foray into a different approach, and that because it was unsuccessful, he reverted to his typical approach based on the scriptures in the next city he visited, namely Corinth in Acts chapter 18. But this claim is kind of unfair. However, there's some, albeit a few, of Paul's listeners in Athens did become Christians, including at least one member of the Areopagus in verse 34. And in addition, as we shall see when we consider 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5, Paul did use reason in his work in Corinth. The smaller response among the audience in Athens is likely to have been because it was a less receptive mission field, one that was steeped in Greek ideas and therefore whose people were not easily persuaded. And so you're going to find this to be the case. Not every opportunity to present the gospel is going to be one teeming with vast numbers of respondents. Doesn't always work that way. Not every place where you preach the gospel is going to be a hugely receptive mission field. And I've been on, scores of mission fields around the world, and it is. I guess it always seems to be, from a preacher's standpoint, an evangelist standpoint, when you stand, especially in these great, massive audiences like in India, and there's literally thousands and thousands of people there, that you see these streams of people responding, and it seemingly blesses your heart. But to go to some places and just not see a great response, even though you preach with the same passion, you feel the same presence and power of the Spirit, but you don't see the brokenness, you don't see souls being saved. At least you don't see the visible responses. But how you think about this should be one of maintaining a position of obedience first, to bear the message. Obedience first to do the work of an apologist evangelist. Recognizing your responsibility to be culturally relevant in doing that, to communicate in the best way, because you simply do not know at what phase, whether you're in some pre-evangelism phase in some way, whether you're the one breaking up the soil, whether you're the one breaking the hardened heart, whether you're the one clearing out the stone, or whatever it is in that whole horticultural analogy, you know. Somebody's got to break up the soil. Somebody's got to clear the sod. Somebody has to make the seed bed ready. You know, not all of us are going to be the great harvesters coming in. But Paul is using a skillful apologetic approach that basically is sensitive to the culture, finding common ground, persuading people to the truth of the gospel. You know, all things to all men. By all means he may win some. And that's 1 Corinthians 9:19-23. So apologetics must work from an understanding of the culture and worldview of the people being reached. It should then start from their cultural beliefs to build a case for the Christian faith. So Acts 17 is a helpful biblical example of positive apologetics in a cross-cultural context. The three different responses of people in Paul's audience, and it's namely this second passage if we looked at Acts 17:22-34. And namely verses 32-34, the response is some sneered, some said they wanted to hear more, some believed. So apologetics seeks to confront false ideas with truth. Some sneered. Some said they wanted to hear more. Apologetics seeks to interest people in the claims of the gospel. Some believe. Apologetics seeks to persuade people to believe Christ. You're going to find people are going to fall into those three categories. And once again, we're reminded apologetics cannot be separated from evangelism, and that it is the goal, and that its goal is not simply to win intellectual debates, but to provide people, to provoke people to consider the gospel and ultimately to trust Christ. So biblical apologetics, one, recognizes the resurrection of Jesus as a key argument for the truth of the gospel. Biblical apologetics starts from an understanding of people's worldview to build bridges to Christian truth. Biblical apologetics expects a response. It aims to confront, provoke, interest, and persuade. So let's leave it there in this lecture.